What is going on, Tentacrew? My name is Billy the Squid, and I am about to make one of the biggest gaming sins that you could possibly make and agree with a gaming journalism site. That is correct. PC Gamers recently came out with an article that is doting that Elden Ring may be the gateway drug to the Souls series. And you know, they may have a point. And while I disagree that smoking the devil's lettuce will make you have a spike in your veins 5 to 10 years down the road, playing Elden Ring very well make a new group of masochists in that same time frame. Let's break it down. Everything about Elden Ring, from its marketing campaign to the gameplay itself, is marketed to put FromSoftware on the map. And you might be saying, well, FromSoftware's been doing pretty good for themselves. The Dark Souls trilogy sold around 30 million copies on all platforms. That is no laughing matter, and you're right, that's not a laughing matter. But when you compare it to other games that are in the similar genre, such as The Witcher 3, such as Skyrim, such as Breath of the Wild, for instance, these numbers for a trilogy are being matched by individual games. The Witcher 3, for instance, has 30 million copies sold by itself. That is the entirety of the Dark Souls trilogy in a single game's sellings. And I know a lot of fans of the Souls series want to keep the Cool Kids Club small and isolated and to ourselves and have a pretty high barrier of entry. But you have to understand that this is a business after all. And I think FromSoftware might have come up with the formula to have your cake and eat it too when it comes to barrier of entry and mass appeal. Other than Bloodborne, which thrived, I feel, on that gothic horror feel, the Dark Souls games, from marketing campaign to actual gameplay elements, really thrived on that isolation and that just down-ridden you versus the world mentality. And that is something that is very much missing from any of the marketing campaign of Elden Ring. Yes, the world is in disarray, just like in every other Souls game that has come out, or any other game FromSoftware has put out. But the difference being is, you don't feel like some lowly plebeian trying to rise from the dirt up to a seat of royalty. It feels like you've been there before, and it feels like this call to adventure is something that is natural for the character and something that is already instilled in you. No longer are you fighting up from the bottom to get there, but you are fighting from a point of fallen grace to get back to that prior spot that you were in. This is a very big tone shift, and while tone might not be the biggest attributor to this mass appeal that Elden Ring is potentially going to see, it definitely does not hurt when a game welcomes you more in with the call of adventure than it does isolation and desolation. It's going to get a lot more people interested in it. This is something that competitor games of the series already thrive upon. Again, The Witcher 3, Skyrim, Breath of the Wild, they all flow on that chosen one mentality and that call to adventure mentality. And I feel like this is the perfect place to do that because, just like all of these games, that call to adventure is met with a large open world landscape for your character to enjoy. And that's the next point I want to talk about. Past Souls games have taken that feeling of desolation from the trailers and integrated it into the gameplay itself. Very claustrophobic corridors, very dark ambiance, a lot of narrow turns that force you into situations that you may not want to get into. Maybe you're not ready for them, but it forces you into them anyway. And while yes, over time you can learn those mechanics and push through, it is not as entry level and easy to understand throwing your head against the wall. Some people just don't learn that way, and that can put a lot of people off. With an open world mindset, it gives a wide range of accessibility to the players. Not necessarily making it easier, but having more options is always going to have a larger range of appeal. Some people just don't learn in a set given way. It's like going to a university, for instance. If all of your lecture is PowerPoints and all visual learning, but you're more of a hands-on learner, you are not going to succeed as well in that class as you would in a class that is primarily hands-on learning. It's just the nature of your character, and there's nothing wrong with that. I love you for you, okay? But in the previous Dark Souls games, they didn't really have those options. Yes, you had different options for approaching combat, whether it be heavy weapons, fast weapons, ranged weapons, magic, but it all funneled into these same narrow corridors, desolate areas. Whereas an open world allows you that scope to circumvent issues that you may not want to, and the game has a lot more mechanics in place to appeal to a wider range of playstyles. The addition of jump mechanics, and stealth mechanics are huge to a Souls game. We saw it with Sekiro, how while that game was probably the most narrowed in on how it wanted you to play from a combat perspective, the stealth mechanic gave a little bit of leniency to the player, so they didn't have to be the best sword fighter until they got to a boss, of course, with the open world mechanics. And that's something that's very similar with Elden Ring. The open world itself has that accessibility due to these increased mechanics and due to the scope and width of the areas that you are going to be traversing. Now, whenever you get into a dungeon, it's going to be very Dark Soulsy and very narrow and very desolate, just like what all of the Souls players are familiar to. And boy, howdy, are the bosses most likely still going to be a make or break moment for players, because they are roadblocks that you are not going to be able to get across outside of learning the combat. But even then, I feel like the open world mechanics will lend players to being able to get to an appropriate power level where they feel comfortable approaching these bosses and actually giving them the good 1-2. That open world comfortability of being able to build up your character's power levels in ways that you weren't able to before, more comfortably than before, will make those uncomfortable moments, such as dungeons, such as bosses, a little bit more bearable. And if you do hit a roadblock like that, you have the full open world landscape behind you to go back and try to find ways of getting yourself a little bit more powerful so that you can come back later. It opens that RPG nature up that these games have always had. You could always grind up power level to get yourself through tough tasks. That's always been the case, but it gives more approachability and more accessibility options for you to be able to build that power level up. Not necessarily easier, just more ways of doing it, in a way that hopefully you will find more appealing. Not to mention there are aspects, and I know the Souls community is going to hate hearing this, there are aspects of this game that are just outright easier compared to the Souls games. This game's accessibility options extend into stuff that maybe artificially created difficulty in the prior games, but it still did create difficulty. The aspects that I'm talking about are, you have a mount in this game, and that allows you to pretty well be able to just shit and get away from any situation that you are not familiar with. And while yes, you could do this in prior Souls games, where if you got a little bit overwhelmed, you could run back into a previous area you cleared, the enemies would de-aggro off of you, and then you could reapproach it in a different way. That was always the option, but sometimes the enemies were faster than you. In this game, you have Torrent, and Torrent, being a mount, you can pretty well get away from any other enemy in the game, unless they are also on mounted horseback. It just gives that option where if you get in over your head, you can quickly vamonos and get right out. Again, this doesn't extend to bosses, and I feel like the bosses are really going to be the make and break moment for players in this game. I've said that time and time again. And I also feel that those bosses are going to be the make and break moment for returning players on their enjoyment level with these games. Because for a returning player, you've had time and time again building up your skills for boss fighting throughout the series. If you played it 1 through 3, you've played Sekiro, you've played Bloodborne, you've played Demon Souls, you have those skills already built up. For a lot of new players, and that is a big audience that this game is trying to appeal to, they are going to have to build up those skills from scratch. And I feel like this big open world landscape gives you kind of a crash course, gives you a big sandbox on how to build up those skills quicker than any of the other games allowed you to. Take into consideration, you also get healing items from clearing out mobs of enemies in the open world, as well as magic flasks from clearing out enemies in the open world. This makes it so that you have a lot more longevity. You don't have to finagle your resources into a long trek. You also have the mount system, so you're able to more quickly traverse from one checkpoint to another, and those checkpoints can be easily teleported to right from the get-go. They've also increased multiplayer accessibility by making it so that pretty well outside of every boss, like main boss gate that they have, there is a summoning pool. So if you end up needing help for those bosses, you can get somebody directly there and not have to worry about dragging a co-op partner through a dungeonscape area and potentially get invaded. They are usually right there. And while people have always put their signs right outside of the boss doors, this just gives that much more accessibility to that multiplayer aspect. So if you need that resource of a co-op partner to help with a boss, they are almost always going to be there for those new players. And so given all of these factors, I think FromSoftware has actually done what a lot of people thought was impossible, taking their tried and true mechanic of death, rebirth, and learning through mistakes, and actually being able to branch it out to a larger audience for mass appeal. I think that Elden Ring easily has the option to expand out the Souls-like family. And they managed to do this all while sticking to their guns, sticking to one difficulty curve that every single player that goes through this game is going to have to go through. And that is part of the bonding experience of the Souls community. Everybody has gone through the same trials, the same tribulations. They have all done the same things. And that is what has brought us this close together as a community and why we are so passionate about the FromSoftware product. And they've found a way of appealing that to a wider audience simply through gameplay mechanics and accessibility, not through any difficulty modifiers, not by making their game more easy either, but by just giving people more options on ways to play the game that they have made. In a world of gaming that is so divided between player bases, it's really nice to see a community that is passionate about a product expanding out like it is. So please, try to be nice to the new players that are coming in. They're going to need our help just like we need their help, so that these games continue to get better, continue to improve over time, and be the best that they possibly can be. And with that being said, much love, Tenant Crew. Bye-bye.